I spent a lot of time in the earlier book, Unseen Realm, on this issue, and a lot of time on the web as well. You know, the key passage, would be Psalm 82, at least for the plurality question, where you have Elohim, Nitzav Ba'adat El, God, Elohim, stands in the midst of the divine council. It has to be singular Elohim there because of the grammar. It's a singular participle. Sorry for the grammar spasm there. But then there's the second half of the verse is Bekerev Elohim Yishpot. In the midst of the Elohim, he passes judgment. So you have in the midst of, you have a group. Mm-hmm. So you have plural Elohim there. You get down to verse 6, it's plural language again. All the pronouns. I said you are sons of the Most High, sons, plural. All of you, gods, so on and so forth. So, you look at this and you say, well, how do we parse this? And the key is, when we see the letters G-O-D, okay, our brain, just because of the way we're taught, either in church or just, in Western civilization, we're taught to sort of assign a specific set of attributes to the letters G, O, and D. That's why when you put an S on it, it creeps people out. Mm-hmm. That is not the way biblical writers thought when they use the word Elohim. You say, well, how do we know, Mike? How do we know? Well, if you actually do something boring, like look up all the occurrences of Elohim, all 2,000 some of them, and actually look at them, what you have is Elohim is actually used of half a dozen different entities besides the God of Israel. Mm. That alone tells you that the term does not speak of a unique set of attributes. Okay, so we have to dispense with that, and it's hard because that's the way we're taught. Elohim is just a term that meant spiritual being, a spirit being. Now, Yahweh is an Elohim, but no other Elohim is Yahweh. Yahweh is distinguished in other passages by attributes. Okay, that's when you do get attributes talked about. Sovereignty, omnipotence, omniscience, all these things that we're taught, they're correct, but they're not linked to one particular word. Now, some of those other gods show up in Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9. And this is where you get the gods over the nations thing. The Old Testament explanation for why other countries have pantheons. Well, it's because of judgment. Mm-hmm. Deuteronomy 32, look it up in the ESV because the ESV uses the Dead Sea Scrolls and translates the Dead Sea Scrolls in this verse, verse 8. When the Most High divided up the nations, he divided them up according to the number of the sons of God. But Israel, verse 9, is Yahweh's portion. Jacob is his allotted inheritance. Mm-hmm. And I do this in the book. I do it online. If you trace through that language of heavenly host, terms like Elohim, through Deuteronomy, you find out that what's going on here is God telling us that, look, back at Babel, when I related to humanity as a mass, that was what the relationship was like, and we were okay with that. We came out of the flood. I said, now go disperse the earth because it's the whole Edenic plan again. He repeats the Edenic covenant. Go make everywhere else in the world like this, all that. But they don't do it. And so God says, fine. Okay, I'm done with you. I'm going to divorce you. I'm going to disinherit you. I'm going to sever the relationship. I'm going to assign you to other gods. Mm-hmm. They're going to be placeholders. Now, Paul in Acts 17 has an inkling that this is somehow related to having the nations return to the true God because he refers to when the Most High allotted all the boundaries, that was somehow going to bring them back to Jesus, or that was the plan. Or, he gets this from the Old Testament. So you have gods who are called Shadim. We didn't get to Shadim in our earlier discussions in Deuteronomy 32:17. Mm-hmm. Translated demons, but that's a guardian entity. It's actually another job description. Mm-hmm. It's a term for a guardian. And that makes perfect sense. They're the guardians of their nations now. They're supposed to direct people according to the just laws of the true God, but they don't do that. And they're condemned in Psalm 82 for being corrupt, for causing chaos on the earth. Mm-hmm. And for seducing Israel. So there's a clear difference between the Most High and them, and they are in rebellion now. This is something that scholars refer to as cosmic geography, because when God judges the nations, when he judges humanity by splitting them up into nations, and he assigns them, allots them to other gods and vice versa, two sides of the same coin. If you go to Deuteronomy 4:19 and 20, it's kind of the flip side of it. When that happens, then, ostensibly it looks like God has no people. He has no family because he's divorced everyone. And that's true. He has severed the relationship between himself and humanity, which he has now divided up into these nations and assigned them to lesser beings than himself. Which is why in verse 9 in Deuteronomy 32, Israel is Yahweh's portion. So in the biblical story, when do the nations get dispersed and divided? Genesis 11. What happens in Genesis 12? It's the call of Abram. Again, it's not a coincidence.
Wow.
Okay, these things are supposed to be read, in sequence. And so God says, in effect, I'm going to raise up for myself my own people from scratch. Watch. And that frames the rest of not only just the Old Testament, but really the Bible, because the Old Testament story from that point on is about Yahweh against these other gods who become rebellious, become enemies, become hostile, and then Israel against the nations. Paul inherits this worldview because he uses terms in the Greek New Testament, in his letters, that are used of these guys back here. And so these are the principalities and the powers and the dominions and the thrones and all this other vocabulary Paul uses. All the terms he uses are terms of geographical dominion. That's not an accident. Okay, and this is a big part of New Testament theology as well. And when it comes to, again, the new book, Reversing Hermon, you have connections between the Watchers, the Apkallu back in Mesopotamia, Babylonian guys, okay, these are Babylonian stories, other parts of Babylonian thinking that you've talked about, Derek, and that becomes part of a whole set of ideas that the world is the way it is because of these guys, and because they came from Babylon, and again, they're trying to pervert the whole situation that how God was trying to relate to humanity and pervert it. And so the Messiah was going to be assigned, part of his job, part of his task was not just reversing what happens at the fall, but taking care of business with these guys as well. And so that, the new book sort of takes that as its, starting
And when
point.
the Mount of Transfiguration, that was not.
Oh, yeah.
I was just about to ask about that. And that's why these books are
That's
so...
good stuff.
Yeah, that's why
Yeah.
these books are so vitally important for
It is
Christians and Bible
just
believers.
so cool.
Yeah, it's phenomenal that there's this, like your subtitle says, the forgotten mission of Jesus Christ. There's this whole part of what Jesus was sent here to do that's completely forgotten by the church.
Yeah.
And it's not even enough to say that these books are the best written on the topic. They're the only.
They're the only written on the topic.
They're
A lot
the
of
only
the stuff
books.
is out
Yeah.
there in academic papers that are written by non-Christians from a strictly academic point of view. These guys have been finding all those papers and bringing them into the Christian purview, and they're interpreting them for us and helping to teach the church what we should have known all along.
It's really astonishing. When I proposed the idea to Tom and to Defender Publishing, I told him, I said, look, everything in Reversing Hermon is going to be the product of some peer-reviewed journal articles, somebody's dissertation, that sort of thing. Nobody in academia, and that's really where my home is in academia, nobody has collected it and put it between two covers.
Right.
It's just astonishing. And so this is a first
Yeah.
in that regard.
And the big difference is that Mike can actually read the Sumerian and the Babylonian, and I
Yes.
can't. But as I mentioned earlier, I'm kind of a history nerd, and so my approach is to just sort of take the academic papers, the journal articles, and try to fit them into the historic narrative and show how it reinforces the biblical narrative, because there are things that happen in history. I mentioned in a previous program about the Amorites and the sin of the Amorites, and the influence that the Amorites had on world history is much greater than we've ever
It's
been taught,
huge.
and
Yeah.
scholars know
It's
this.
huge.
I mean, hopefully we'll get an opportunity to talk about the Red Sea crossing at
We
some
have
point.
one more program,
Yeah.
so we'll talk.
We'll save it for that. But I
Yeah.
mean, the Amorites, arguably, in terms of biblical history, had as much influence on the theology of the Bible as I would argue that they were literally a tool of the enemy to try to derail God's plan for humanity's salvation.
Quick question. Is the sin of the Amorites complete yet?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I really don't. I would suggest not, because
And if you don't know what I mean by asking that question, that is something that the Lord says, that we're going to leave this alone because the sin of the Amorites is not yet complete.
We could argue that it was because he tied the return of Israel to the land that God had chosen and promised to
Right,
Abraham.
that 400-year period.
Right, when the sin of the Amorites was complete. And yet, as I mentioned, the Amorites were the ones who founded Babylon, the old Babylonian kingdom of King Hammurabi. That was founded by Amorites. Scholars know this, but in the church we don't know it. We think, Babylonian is an ethnicity, and it's not. It's like saying I'm a Chicagoan because that's where I was born. No, I'm English, Welsh, Swedish, German.
Right.
Not a Chicagoan. The Babylonians were Amorites, and they founded this occult system that is the symbol for the one world religion, Babylon the Great, that's coming at the end of time. It's amazing what you just start picking at some threads here, what you find out, and then find out that historians know this, and the ancient linguists know this, and why isn't this getting from over here to over here?
It's just primary texts, and it never filters down into the church. And I am a firm believer that the ministry, pastors, habitually, regularly underestimate the appetite of the people in their churches for content.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so I am no longer going to protect people from their Bible. That's just, I'm not going to do it anymore. I think people can handle it. Some of them won't. But people know, many Christians have an intuitive sense that they're not being taught. There's got to be something more to it than this. And your intuition is correct. And again, like Derek was saying, this is, a lot of this stuff is like 101 for scholars because they have their heads in this every day. But and even evangelical scholars are hesitant to make it part of the way they train students. And there are good reasons for that. Hey, we got to get through X amount of material in a semester or class. I get that. But at some point, you need to be teaching your students that, look, this is material that the biblical writers understood and understood well. And what they're producing responds to it, tweaks it, sometimes pokes it in the eye, uses it for fodder, and you cannot possibly understand what they were trying to communicate unless you know this stuff too. Well, Sin of the Watchers, is really twofold. There's the transgression idea, that we sort of immediately think of when we read Genesis 6:1-4. Again, Watchers is a term, the Enochian term for the sons of God at Genesis 6. But there's this sort of secondary, or not really secondary, but in our mind secondary idea of the Watchers are the ones, because of the Babylonian backstory, the civilizers of humanity. They're the ones who basically teach humanity how to corrupt themselves and, how to be effective at it. Again, how to pervert something a technology that might have been useful for something good, turn it into warfare, turn it into this, that, the other thing. So all of these elements are transgressions. Now, the thing that sort of links the two is the transgression is very sexual in nature, and one of the things that the Watchers get accused of corrupting humanity with, this reference to makeup and hairdos and all this kind of stuff. Well, it's not that those things are inherently wrong. It's that they are used in the art of seduction. Okay? That's how the ancient people perceived it. And so when you have immorality generally, okay, that everybody knows that we shouldn't do this or that, it gets linked back to this, again, just as a train of thought. So when you go to the genealogies, there are 4 women mentioned in the genealogies, and scholars have bickered back and forth about, well, is the point that they're all Gentiles, and this, a couple of them we know are Gentiles, the other ones maybe who knows, and frankly some would say who cares, because what I do in reversing Hermann is I utilize a recent dissertation by someone named Amy Richter at the University of Marquette. And her thesis I find pretty compelling. She says if you actually look at the stories of these 4 women, there are sort of keywords in either Greek or Aramaic used in telling their stories, or Hebrew, that somehow link all 4 of them back to either a sexual transgression they did or that was done to them, And it's the same vocabulary that will show up in Enochian texts about the Watchers or biblical texts about the Watchers. And her conclusion is that that's not a coincidence. So she thinks that the women were chosen. And again, I'm in agreement with her. I think there's a lot to this. That the women in the genealogies were chosen specifically to say this. It's theological messaging. There's going to be one who comes from this line in which these 4 women are, whose backstories, get traced back to all this stuff. These 4 women are going to play a role in producing the one that will reverse all of that. So their inclusion sort of telegraphs a reversal theme in the genealogies. Now, if you look at the genealogies otherwise, 3 groups of 14, by gematria, that's David, son of David. I mean, scholars are all over that other stuff.
Sure.
But her contribution is specifically the women and how the way their stories are told link back. There's these points of attachments back to the Watcher story. Ruth, okay, Boaz is called a Gibor. Ruth is a Gevurah. Okay, this is terminology that was used in Genesis 6:4. That's just one example. But Richter has, half dozen, 8, 9, 10 of these specifically that relate into these stories that link back to this whole, again, matrix of ideas that concerns how the Watchers corrupted people. So they're going to produce the Messiah who will undo this.
We need to go to break, but I want to ask you really quickly, is this in any way connected to God's promise to Eve that she would be saved through childbirth?
I think, ultimately the answer to that depends on how you take that reference. Since I do sort of lean that way that we're talking about, the whole women plural being, saved in childbirth, that kind of thing. I think it actually is a reference back to Eve. So I tend to gravitate to where you're going with that. This is part of what scholars refer to as the divine march or divine warrior theme in the Old Testament. And, following at his heels, okay, is an important part of the description. In other words, they're not leading the pack.
Right.
Okay, they're following behind. And the theological messaging again is that it's Yahweh, the divine warrior who's on the march, who has the power of life and death. Not these guys. They are at his beck and command, not the other way around. So an Israelite would not have read this and conceived of them as equals. You could probably, some might have conceived of them as just sort of, not imbecilic bad guys under control, but things that needed to be, under control, brought under control. And I think that's consistent with the messaging, because ultimately the things that happen in war, the things that happen, the bad things that happen in life, there's a greater intelligence, behind them, and it's the God of Israel. It's not random. It's not, something that he can't control or has to, fret about. He's not fretting about it. And if you want to know who's in charge of life and death, then this is the person whose side you need to be on.
Yeah.
These 2 books, I think, are going to be so important for every Christian's library. It's not only going to help you to understand the Old Testament and New Testament, it will help you to understand Bible prophecy, which takes me to my next question. Are the nations still under the control of the fallen?
See, I would say no, but that doesn't mean they're not in power.
That's a wiggly answer.
Here's what I mean. Like on my podcast, nakedbiblepodcast.com, I'm trying to remember the episode that we did. It's in the 90s or hundreds or something. We did an episode on the theme of the resurrection and the death of the gods. And Paul, when he talks about the resurrection in 1 Corinthians 15, that was our launching point for the episode. For some reason, Paul reflexively, when he thinks about the resurrection, he not only thinks like we do that, I'm going to get a new body. That's how we always parse it. He habitually mentions that the resurrection is linked to the idea of the demise and the destruction of the gods. Now, if you have the Deuteronomy 32 worldview in your head, that the gods of the nations, they were assigned by Yahweh. Yes, they became corrupt and they're rebels, but that's still where they got their authority. The original plan was, again, that they should administer it well until the Lord brought everybody back into the family. Well, since we have this rebellion situation, the resurrection really is key to this. When Christ rose from the dead, Paul links it to him being elevated over, victory over the principalities, the powers, the rulers of darkness, all this kind of language. Now, you think, and in the episode we go back to Plato, where they had this worldview that they worship the gods that they do because they were assigned to them by the bigger gods. You know, they have the same idea, but Paul's message is, look, the Most High is the one who created this situation, and now he's taking it back. Not only has he broken the authority of the gods over the nations, you are no longer enslaved. Not only is that a change of circumstance, essentially God telling them, you're fired, okay? But now he's insisting that the people of the nations abandon them in favor of Christ. Now, the Most High is calling you back home. This is Gentile salvation. Don't listen, to your spiritual authorities now. Don't even listen to, to the Jews who are telling you, well, you guys belong over here. You don't belong over here with the people of God. No, they're done. They're toast. And this is why Paul continually goes back to this link between the resurrection and their undoing of authority. Now, he addresses the Galatians and he says, are you people insane? Having been freed from this, you're going back? So they're only as powerful as people let them be.
Yeah.
Those who reject the gospel give them power. They do not have legitimate spiritual power in terms of owning people, owning their citizens.